An ordinary mechanic bought an old 1937 Cadillac at auction, dreaming of restoring the legend. But when he removed the seats, his body trembled at what he found hidden inside for almost a century. Subscribe and write in the comments. Which city are you watching from? The morning sun rose slowly over Detroit, casting long golden beams across the old industrial buildings and the cracked asphalt of forgotten parking lots. For many, it was just another day, another cycle of work and routine, but for Daniel Harper, it was a day charged with anticipation. He had dreamed about this kind of opportunity for years, quietly saving every dollar that did not have to go toward rent, tools, or food. His small garage was both sanctuary and workshop, a place where he poured his sweat and time into resurrecting pieces of American history on four wheels. Yet, deep down, he longed for something greater, a chance to restore not just any car, but one that carried with it a story, a soul, a history so powerful that the work would become a kind of communion with the past. That was why he was on his way to the estate auction. The road was lined with warehouses and auto shops that reminded Daniel of his childhood walks with his father. His father had worked long shifts in an automotive plant, returning home with hands stained with grease, skin roughened by years of handling steel. Daniel had inherited not only those strong hands but also a fascination for machines, especially those from an earlier era when design was as much about art as function. As a boy, he had dreamed of owning a workshop where he could breathe life back into forgotten cars. Now, though his shop was modest, cluttered with old parts and dented tools, it was his kingdom. Today, he hoped to add a jewel to it. When he arrived at the auction grounds, he stepped out of his truck and felt the buzz in the air immediately. Collectors and mechanics moved between rows of vehicles, some polished to a blinding sheen, others barely more than skeletal remains of what they once had been. The scent of rust mingled with fresh paint and gasoline, creating an atmosphere Daniel knew by heart. Auctioneers shouted the details of upcoming lots, their voices blending into a chorus of numbers and promises. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed by the sheer spectacle of it all, yet he reminded himself why he was here. He moved between cars, running his fingers over the curves of fenders, inhaling the faint must of old leather interiors. Some vehicles caught his attention with their elegance, others with their battered defiance against time. But then, halfway down one of the rows, his eyes fell upon it. A Cadillac, 1937 by the look of it, and not just any Cadillac. Though its black paint was faded and chipped, though the chrome trim was dulled and scarred, the car exuded a presence that the polished sports cars around it could not match. Its long hood, the graceful arch of the fenders, the proud grille standing like the face of a silent sentinel. All of it spoke to him. Daniel stepped closer, his heart quickening. The car bore the scars of neglect, tires sagging against the cracked asphalt, a windshield fogged with dust, a bench seat inside torn at the seams. But none of that diminished its grandeur. He placed a hand against the side of the car, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. In that moment, a strange certainty filled him. This was not merely a machine. This was a story waiting to be told, a mystery buried in rust and dust. His father had often said that every car remembered the road it had traveled, that steel and leather kept the echoes of voices, laughter, and tears. Daniel believed it now more than ever. As the auctioneer's assistant announced the lot number, a small crowd gathered. Some looked at the Cadillac with curiosity, others with disdain. To most, it was a burden, a relic too expensive to restore and too shabby to display. But Daniel could not look away. He joined the bidding cautiously at first, testing the waters with modest raises of his hand. The price climbed steadily, though not with the frenzy of the rarer sports cars or pristine luxury sedans that had passed before. A pair of collectors seemed interested, but their enthusiasm waned as the numbers rose. One by one, they dropped out, shaking their heads. Daniel's pulse raced. He knew the limit of what he could spend. Every dollar he had tucked away from long months of side jobs and sleepless nights at the garage. The auctioneer's chant echoed in his ears like the pounding of a drum. When the gavel finally came down, the price was just shy of that limit. The Cadillac was his. For a moment, he stood still, stunned by the reality. He had done it. He had risked nearly everything, and now the car belonged to him. The crowd dispersed quickly, as they always did, rushing to the next spectacle. Daniel lingered, staring at the car that was now his responsibility. He felt a mixture of triumph and fear. The money was gone, and he had no safety net. But as he walked around the Cadillac again, he felt something deeper than fear. He felt purpose. The car was waiting, silent but alive, like an old warrior who had not spoken in decades, but still carried stories in his bones. Arrangements were made, papers signed, and the Cadillac was transported to his garage later that afternoon. Daniel followed in his truck, glancing constantly in the rearview mirror as though he feared the car might vanish if he stopped looking. When it was finally unloaded into his workshop, he closed the doors and stood alone with it. The garage smelled of oil and iron. Tools hung neatly on the walls, though everything bore the marks of long use. Now, in the center of that humble space, the Cadillac loomed like a sleeping giant. He walked around it slowly, tracing its curves with his eyes, whispering to himself about the work ahead. The engine would need rebuilding, the body stripping, the interior reupholstering. It would be months, maybe years, before the car gleamed again. But Daniel was not daunted. He had faced harder battles in life than stubborn bolts or rusted frames. He pulled a stool close and sat, studying the car as though it might reveal its secrets if he only looked long enough. As night settled outside, the garage glowed under the harsh white of fluorescent lights. Daniel lost track of time, his mind filled with plans and calculations. Yet more than that, he felt a strange undercurrent, a whisper of intuition telling him this Cadillac carried more than worn steel and faded paint. There was something hidden within it, something waiting to be discovered. He could not yet name the feeling, but it wrapped around him like a shiver. He remembered his father's words again. Cars carry memories. At last he rose, placing a hand once more on the hood. The day had been long, the risk great, but he knew one thing with certainty. This car was not simply a purchase. It was the beginning of something far larger, a journey he had not yet begun to understand. He turned off the lights and left the garage, the Cadillac resting silently in the shadows, holding tight to whatever secrets it had guarded for decades. And so the first step had been taken. Daniel Harper had purchased not only a car, but also a doorway into a forgotten world. He could not yet see where the path would lead, but already the bond between man and machine had been forged. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The following morning came quietly, as though the city itself had not yet awakened from the long night. Daniel rose before dawn, unable to sleep. The thought of the Cadillac resting in his garage weighed on him in the most exhilarating way, filling him with both excitement and responsibility. He drank a quick cup of coffee, its bitterness grounding him, then pulled on his work clothes, oil-stained jeans and a shirt that had seen countless days of labor, and headed out to the garage. The air outside was brisk, carrying the faint scent of rain on the horizon, but within his chest there was a fire. When he unlocked the garage door and pushed it open, the sight of the Cadillac waiting in the dim light struck him again with awe. The car seemed larger than life in the stillness of the morning, a relic that had weathered decades of silence yet remained proud. Daniel walked around it slowly, running his hand along the body as though greeting an old friend. The paint flaked beneath his touch, leaving dust on his fingertips, but beneath the neglect, the soul of the machine pulsed steady and strong. He began with a careful inspection, circling the car and making notes in his mind about what would need attention. The engine bay was caked with grime, hoses brittle, bolts corroded from years of disuse. The body bore scars of time, rust creeping up from the wheel wells, chrome dulled by oxidation, glass fogged with a stubborn haze. The interior told a story of its own, leather seats cracked and torn, stuffing bulging like wounds beneath, a steering wheel polished smooth by hands long gone. Yet none of this discouraged Daniel. In fact, it drew him deeper, for he had always believed that the imperfections of an old car were like the wrinkles of an aged face, each mark a testament to a life lived. Hours passed as he set about the initial tasks of disassembly. He removed bolts that protested with shrill squeaks, pried apart panels reluctant to let go of their bonds, and cataloged each part with methodical care. His garage filled with the music of labor, the clang of tools, the hum of a grinder, the occasional curse when a stubborn piece refused to yield. Sweat darkened his shirt, but he pressed on, driven by something more than simple determination. As he worked, he found himself talking softly to the car as if coaxing it awake. He spoke of the roads it must have traveled, the people it must have carried, the laughter or sorrow it had once enclosed within its walls. His father's words returned again and again. Every car carries memories. Daniel could feel those memories stirring, like whispers rising from the shadows of the past. By midday, he turned his attention to the interior. The front bench seat immediately struck him as peculiar. When he pressed against it, expecting the usual give of old springs, he felt an unnatural firmness, as if something had been wedged inside or beneath. He frowned and tried to shift it forward, but the seat refused to budge. He tried again, tugging harder this time, but still it remained stubbornly fixed. Puzzled, he fetched his tools. With a wrench and pry bar, he worked at the bolts anchoring the seat, expecting them to come free with effort. Instead, it was as if the metal had been welded into place, locked by more than rust. Daniel knelt, sweat dripping into his eyes, and wrestled with the unyielding frame. Time slipped by unnoticed, measured only by the deepening ache in his arms and the growing frustration in his chest. Yet, amid the struggle, his curiosity sharpened. This was not normal wear, nor the result of decades of neglect. Someone had meant for this seat to stay in place. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Why would anyone go to such lengths to secure it? What could possibly be hidden beneath? The idea of a secret compartment began to take shape in his mind, a wild notion that nonetheless clung to him with the weight of inevitability. The hours stretched into the afternoon. Each attempt left him more exhausted, but also more resolved. He shifted his approach, attacking the problem with patient precision rather than brute force. Slowly, bit by bit, the bolts loosened, shrieking in protest as if resisting not just his hands, but the very act of revealing what lay concealed. His knuckles bled where they scraped against metal, but he hardly noticed. Finally, after nearly an hour of relentless effort, there came a sharp crack, a sound that echoed in the garage like a gunshot. The seat lurched, shifting for the first time. Daniel froze, heart pounding in his chest. He pushed again, and with a groan of protest, the bench seat began to slide forward, revealing a dark cavity beneath. He leaned closer, the beam of his work lamp casting light into the space. What he saw made him draw in a sharp breath. The cavity was not empty. He reached in cautiously, his fingers brushing against surfaces that were not part of the car. The touch was strange, worn leather, cool and supple even after all these years. His hand closed around the object, and with slow care he pulled it into the open. It was a satchel, brown leather darkened by age, its buckles corroded but still intact. The smell of time clung to it, a mix of dust and decay that spoke of decades unseen. Daniel's pulse quickened. He placed the satchel gently on his workbench and peered back into the cavity. There was another, nearly identical, nestled against the first. With trembling hands, he drew that one out as well, setting it beside its twin. The garage seemed unnaturally quiet as he stood staring at the satchels. For a long moment, he did not move, as though afraid that opening them might shatter the fragile spell of discovery. He reached out, tracing a finger along the cracked leather, imagining the hands that had last touched these bags. Whose were they? Why had they been hidden here? What secrets had slept beneath that seat for so many years? His mind whirled with questions, but beneath them all was a deeper certainty. This was no accident. The Cadillac had called to him at the auction for a reason. It had waited decades, silent and patient for someone willing to listen. And now, in the dim light of his garage, Daniel Harper stood on the threshold of a story that would bind his life to the past in ways he could not yet imagine. The day's work had exhausted him, yet his hands shook not from fatigue but from anticipation. He knew that whatever lay inside those satchels would change everything. The Cadillac had kept its secret hidden through war and peace, through generations that had forgotten it. Now the time had come for that secret to be revealed. Daniel leaned back against the workbench, staring at the bags as the light outside faded into evening. The garage was once again swallowed by silence, but it was no longer the silence of ordinary nights. It was the silence of a story waiting to be told, of a door about to open. Tomorrow he would find the courage to unlatch those buckles and peer inside. Tonight, he simply let the weight of the discovery settle into his bones, knowing that he had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Night had been restless for Daniel. He had gone to bed late, unable to resist the urge to step back into the garage again and again, just to look at the two weathered satchels sitting on his workbench. Each time, he had turned the light on, stared at them for several minutes, and then forced himself away. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, full of strange dreams of open roads, shadows whispering from the past, and leather bags that seemed to breathe. By the time morning light crept into his small bedroom, he rose with a weight in his chest, as though he knew the day ahead would not be ordinary. The garage was colder than usual when he entered, the air thick with the smell of oil, dust, and leather that had lain untouched for decades. The Cadillac loomed in the corner, its stripped interior gaping like a wound, its silence heavier than before. The bench seat lay half pulled aside, exposing the hollow space beneath, and Daniel felt again the awe of the moment when he had forced it free. He had wrestled with metal all his life, but he had never fought against something that resisted, not just with bolts and rust, but with the impression of intent. Whoever had hidden these satchels had wanted them to remain hidden. He stood before the workbench where the bags waited. Their surfaces were cracked with age, the leather stiff, yet not brittle, the buckles corroded to a dull green. He touched one lightly, and a faint smell rose, old paper, mildew, and something indefinably human, as though memory itself had a scent. His hands trembled as he unfastened the first buckle. The metal resisted, but with a groan it came undone. The flap lifted slowly, and inside lay bundles of paper, folded and yellowed, bound with twine that disintegrated at his touch. He pulled them out carefully, laying them on the bench one by one. They were letters. The ink faded to brown, the handwriting elegant and precise. At the top of one he read a date, 1932. He unfolded it gently, his eyes tracing the words, though he barely absorbed them at first. Names, places, words of affection and worry, all flowing in a voice from a time long gone. He felt as though he were eavesdropping on ghosts. Beneath the letters were photographs. Small, square prints, their edges curled, black and white faces staring out with solemn eyes. Families gathered on porches, men in suits standing proudly by storefronts, women in dresses holding children close. One photo caught him in particular. A man standing beside a gleaming Cadillac, not unlike the one in his garage, a hand resting on the hood, as though claiming it as part of his own story. The man's eyes, though captured in grainy monochrome, held a defiant pride. He set the letters and photographs aside and reached deeper into the bag. His hand closed around fabric, rough, heavy, a sack of some kind. He drew it out, and as he loosened the cord that held it shut, small metallic shapes spilled into his palm. He gasped, the sound loud in the still garage. Gold pocket watches, their cases dull but unmistakably precious, tumbled out alongside rings, necklaces, and brooches. Some were engraved, others plain, all of them heavy with value. The light from the bare bulb above caught on their surfaces, sending faint glimmers across the walls. Daniel's heart hammered. Jewelry, watches, letters, photographs. This was no ordinary cache. It was treasure, not in the sense of pirates and buried chests, but in the sense of a family's entire legacy preserved in secret. He sat back, the weight of it overwhelming. He thought of the decades these items had lain in silence beneath the seat, carried through years of war, peace, and social upheaval, forgotten as generations passed. Curiosity overcame him, and he reached for the second satchel. Its buckle resisted more stubbornly, but eventually gave way. Inside were more papers, though these looked official. Deeds, certificates, records of ownership, receipts from a jewelry store, some with handwritten notes in the margins. There were also more photographs, this time of the store itself, a modest establishment with bold lettering across its window. A man, the same as in the earlier photo, stood proudly behind the counter, glass cases filled with watches and jewelry gleaming before him. Daniel stared, the pieces beginning to form a picture. Whoever this man had been, he was not just a customer of luxury. He had been a jeweler, perhaps even the owner of the very store depicted. And when times grew hard, when banks collapsed and thieves prowled desperate streets during the Depression, he had hidden his most valuable possessions where no one would think to look, beneath the seat of his prized Cadillac. The realization sent chills through Daniel. He felt connected across time to the man in those photographs, another craftsman working with his hands, another man who understood the value of both labor and legacy. The thought that these treasures had survived untouched for nearly 90 years made him dizzy. He sat for a long time, letters and photographs spread before him, jewelry glittering faintly under the light. His mind wandered, Imagine the moment when the jeweler had decided to hide them. Perhaps he had done so in fear, perhaps in hope of retrieving them later. Did he intend to pass them on to his children but never got the chance? Had the car been sold after his death, the secret never revealed? So many questions crowded his thoughts, each heavier than the last. The day passed unnoticed, the outside world forgotten. Daniel read letter after letter, piecing together fragments of lives lived almost a century earlier. There were notes from family members, business correspondents, even fragments of poetry scrawled in the margins. The voices of the past filled the garage until it felt as though he were surrounded by unseen witnesses. As evening descended, Daniel gathered the items carefully, placing them back in the satchels with reverence. He looked once more at the Cadillac, its stripped interior yawning open, and felt an unshakable conviction that he was now part of something greater than a restoration project. This car was more than steel and rubber. It was a vault of memory, a vessel of human history, waiting for someone to uncover its truths. The discovery had changed everything. He had thought he was buying a car to restore and perhaps sell, but now he knew he had purchased a story. And not just any story, a story rooted in fear and hope, and survival and silence, and treasures hidden away for safekeeping. He could not walk away from it now. The Cadillac had chosen him, and its secrets had bound him to its fate. That night, as he locked the garage and stepped into the cool air, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was the keeper of a legacy. The next step would be to find out exactly whose it was and what had become of the family that once trusted their treasures to the safety of a car seat. The journey was only beginning, and Daniel Harper knew he would follow it wherever it led. The night after his discovery was different from the restless evening before. Now that the satchels were opened, their secrets spilled across his workbench, Daniel felt both exhilarated and burdened. He had uncovered something extraordinary, but he understood instinctively that this was only the beginning. The Cadillac had given up a secret, but secrets never emerged in isolation. They trailed questions, mysteries, and responsibilities like shadows. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and the dim glow of the streetlight outside, his mind turned again and again to the man in the photographs. The proud figure, with one hand resting on the Cadillac, the same model now in his garage, had become more than an image. He was a presence that lingered. Daniel knew he could not rest until he understood who this man was, and why his life had left treasures locked beneath a seat for nearly 90 years. The next morning, he sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and spread the documents out before him. He had taken them carefully from the satchels, choosing the clearest to examine by the soft light of dawn. Receipts for jewelry sales bore the name of a store, Johnson's Fine Jewelry. Letters were signed with the name Nathaniel, or simply Nate. There were references to a neighborhood in Detroit that Daniel knew well, though the stores there had long been replaced with empty lots or boarded-up facades. The handwriting was elegant, measured, and full of dignity, even when the letters spoke of hardship. One, dated 1932, mentioned fear of the banks and keeping what we can safe. That line echoed in Daniel's mind, an explanation as clear as it was heartbreaking. He returned to the garage after breakfast, carrying a notebook where he had jotted down addresses, names, and dates from the letters. The Cadillac sat waiting, its stripped-down interior now feeling less like a gutted machine and more like a hollow chest from which treasures had spilled. The satchels remained on the bench, their contents carefully sorted, but Daniel found himself speaking to the car as if it were a witness. He whispered that he would find the truth, that he would not let the history of Nathan Johnson vanish into silence. His first stop was the local library, a brick building that had stood since the 1920s. Inside, the air smelled of paper and polish, and sunlight fell in dusty beams across the reading tables. At the information desk, Daniel asked about old city directories and newspaper archives. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with a quiet smile, guided him to a set of microfilm reels and a computer that contained digitized records. For hours, he scrolled through decades of history, watching advertisements and articles flicker past like ghosts on the screen. And there it was, in a Detroit newspaper dated 1939, an advertisement for Johnson's fine jewelry. The image was small, a drawing of a pocket watch above bold letters proclaiming quality and honesty. Beneath it was the address, one Daniel recognized as a street corner not far from where he had grown up. He leaned closer, staring at the grainy print, feeling the weight of connection. This was real. The man from the photograph had stood behind a counter in that very shop, serving customers, building a life in a city that was not always kind to men of his skin. Further searches revealed more fragments. A notice in 1942 listed Sergeant Nathan Johnson among those returning from service overseas. Another article spoke of a fire in a downtown building in 1948, mentioning several businesses destroyed, though Johnson's fine jewelry was not among them. There were no obituaries that matched, no clear end to the story. It was as if Nathan had walked out of history, leaving only faint traces. Daniel left the library with photocopies of what he had found, his notebook filled with scribbled notes. The city outside felt changed to him, layered with invisible echoes of the past. As he drove through familiar streets, he imagined how they might have looked in the 1930s and 40s, when Nathan was alive, when the Cadillac was new and gleaming. He pictured families dressed in their Sunday best, children pressing their noses to the jewelry store window, Nathan standing tall with pride in his craft. The next day, Daniel visited the address from the advertisement. The building was gone, replaced by a crumbling lot surrounded by chain-link fence. Weeds pushed through the cracked pavement, and a faded sign for a corner store hung loosely across the street. But, in his mind's eye, Daniel could see it. The glass cases, the watches, the careful arrangement of rings and necklaces. He closed his eyes and tried to feel the heartbeat of that vanished place. Back at the garage, the investigation took on a more personal dimension. Daniel compared the faces in the photographs with the names he had found in the letters. There was a woman who appeared often, always beside Nathan. Her name was Lydia, mentioned in affectionate tones in several letters. Children, too, appeared, their names scrawled in ink, Samuel and Grace. One photograph showed them posed in front of the Cadillac, Nathan with his arm draped proudly around Lydia, the children standing straight and solemn. It was a family frozen in time, and yet their lives must have stretched on beyond that moment. What had happened to them? As he pieced these fragments together, Daniel felt something stir within him. It was more than curiosity. It was kinship. Nathan Johnson had been a craftsman, a man who worked with his hands to create beauty, who carved out dignity in a world that often denied it. Daniel saw himself reflected in that struggle. He, too, had built his life against odds, had wrestled with prejudice and scarcity, had clung to the dream of creating something lasting. The Cadillac, once merely a machine to be restored, had become a bridge between their lives. Evenings stretched long as Daniel pored over the letters again and again. Some spoke of love and longing, of Lydia waiting for Nathan's return from war. Others mentioned the difficulties of running a business in hard times, the fear of theft, the worry of banks collapsing. Each word carried weight, not just as ink on paper, but as living memory. Daniel read them aloud sometimes, his voice trembling as if the act itself honored the writer. The more he learned, the more he felt compelled to continue. He searched online databases, scoured ancestry records, and spoke to older members of the local community who remembered bits and pieces of the past. A retired pastor recalled a man named Johnson who had once run a jewelry store, describing him as upright and proud. A neighbor, now in her 80s, remembered hearing that the family moved away sometime in the 1950s, though she could not say where. Each fragment added to the mosaic, though the picture was still incomplete. Through it all, the Cadillac stood silent in the garage, its empty interior like a witness refusing to speak until the right questions were asked. Daniel worked on it in the daylight hours, removing rust, cataloging parts, and imagining the moment when it would shine again. But every time his hands touched the metal, he thought of Nathan's hands, the same surfaces once gripped by another man decades before. It made the work sacred in a way he had never felt before. By the time weeks had passed, Daniel had gathered enough to know that Nathan Johnson was not just a jeweler or a soldier. He was a man who had carried the hopes of his family, who had chosen to hide his treasures not in a bank vault or safe, but in the belly of his beloved car. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was trust in something he felt was unbreakable. Either way, the decision had preserved his legacy until Daniel uncovered it. Sitting one evening with the photographs spread before him, Daniel realized he could not stop here. The story was unfinished. Somewhere out there, descendants of Nathan Johnson might still live, unaware of the treasures their grandfather had left behind. To keep this history locked in his own garage would be a betrayal. He had been chosen as the keeper of the secret, but keeping was not enough. He would have to pass it on. The decision settled over him like a vow. He would find them. He would uncover the path of Nathan's family, however long it took. The Cadillac had entrusted him with a legacy, and he would see it returned. He looked up at the car resting under the fluorescent lights, its bare frame gleaming faintly, and whispered aloud that the journey was far from over. The past had spoken, but the future waited, and Daniel Harper would not rest until he answered its call. The decision to find Nathan Johnson's descendants had settled firmly in Daniel's heart, but with it came a new wave of emotions he had not expected. In the quiet evenings after long days of work, he would sit at his kitchen table or in the dim garage with the photographs spread before him, and he found himself staring into those black and white eyes as though searching for fragments of himself. It was not merely curiosity anymore. It was a bond that grew stronger with every passing day. He began to see parallels between Nathan's story and his own, lines of struggle and resilience that stretched across time to meet in the present. One evening, while cleaning grime from the Cadillac's hood, Daniel caught himself reflecting on his own life in a way he rarely allowed. He had grown up in a neighborhood where survival often meant keeping your head down, where opportunities for young men who looked like him were scarce and fleeting. He remembered the sting of being dismissed or underestimated, the subtle looks that told him he was not expected to succeed. Yet he had persisted, saving what little he could, building a dream brick by brick. His garage was not much by the standards of wealthier mechanics, but to him it was a monument to determination. As he polished the metal beneath his hands, he imagined Nathan doing the same nearly a century earlier, facing a world just as unkind, yet holding his head high. The more he learned about Nathan through the letters, the more Daniel felt as if the man was speaking directly to him. There were passages in which Nathan wrote to Lydia of his exhaustion, of days when customers doubted his honesty because of the color of his skin, of nights when he wondered whether his children would have a future worth the sacrifices he made. Daniel had never met this man, but the words resonated with the marrow of his bones. He, too, had faced days of doubt when bills piled high and customers questioned his work before it was even done. He, too, had worried whether his sacrifices would amount to anything, whether his own children, should he one day have them, would inherit something more than struggle. In those moments of reflection, the Cadillac became more than a machine to him. It was a symbol of survival, of pride, of unyielding spirit. Every time he touched the cracked steering wheel or the rusted frame, he imagined Nathan's hands there before his, gripping with the same mixture of pride and determination. It was as if the car itself was a bridge, carrying not only memories but also strength from one man to another. Daniel began to feel that his restoration work was no longer just about bringing back beauty. It was about honoring a spirit, about reviving a story that had nearly been lost. There were nights when Daniel sat in the driver's seat of the stripped-down car, staring through the dusty windshield at nothing in particular, letting his imagination wander. He pictured Nathan sitting there decades ago, Lydia beside him, the children in the back, driving through a city alive with jazz and hardship, hope and fear mingled in every street. He could almost hear the laughter of the children, the quiet conversations between husband and wife, the hum of the engine carrying them forward. It felt strange to inhabit another man's life in such a way, yet it comforted him. He was not alone in his struggles. Others had walked this road before. The deeper the connection grew, the more Daniel began to question his own path. He had spent years working tirelessly, saving every penny, pouring his soul into machines that often went to customers who cared more about polish than history. He had told himself it was enough just to keep going, to survive another year, to hold on to the garage against all odds. But now, standing in the presence of Nathan's legacy, he wondered if there was something greater he was meant to do. Was it his task to be not only a mechanic but also a guardian of stories, a man who restored not just metal but memory? One afternoon, as the sun poured through the high windows of his garage, Daniel caught sight of himself in the dusty glass of a cabinet. For a moment, he saw not just his own face, tired and lined with years of labor, but Nathan's as well. The resemblance was not physical, but something deeper, a shared expression of endurance. It startled him, and yet it also steadied him. He felt a quiet affirmation rise within. He was on the right path. The Cadillac had come into his life not by chance, but by some invisible design. He began to treat the restoration differently. Where once he might have hurried through the process, eager to finish, now he moved slowly, reverently, as though each bolt and panel carried a story that deserved respect. He spoke to the car more often, sometimes aloud, sometimes in thought, as though conversing with Nathan himself. He promised he would see the car shine again, not for profit or vanity, but as a tribute. He imagined presenting it not at an auction or show, but to the family who had nearly forgotten its existence, as proof that their ancestor had left more than silence behind. At the same time, Daniel's personal memories intruded. He thought often of his father, whose hands had been calloused by years of factory work, whose eyes had held both weariness and pride. His father had not lived to see Daniel open his garage, but Daniel knew he would have understood the significance of what he had found. He remembered conversations at the dinner table, his father urging him to stand tall, to work harder than anyone else, because the world would demand it of him. Now he realized that Nathan must have told his children similar things, words of resilience passed down like heirlooms. The Cadillac, stripped bare, seemed to echo those voices. Its silence was no longer empty but filled with meaning. Daniel found himself spending longer hours in the garage, sometimes not even working but simply sitting with the car, absorbing its presence. It gave him a sense of belonging he had not felt before, as if his own life had been braided into a larger story. He was not just a man fighting alone against adversity. He was part of a lineage of fighters, men who had built with their hands and endured with their hearts. As the weeks passed, the connection deepened until it shaped every choice he made. Friends who visited the garage noticed the change in him, though they could not name it. He seemed more focused, more grounded, as though he carried a purpose larger than himself. When asked why he spent so many hours on that old Cadillac, he would smile faintly and say it was special, though he rarely explained further. Some things could not be explained. They had to be felt. It was during one such quiet evening, with the garage bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, that Daniel made a final decision. He would not only restore the car and uncover the past, he would return the treasures to the family. Whatever hardship it took, he would track them down, find Nathan's descendants, and place the photographs, the letters, the medallions into their hands. They had been hidden for decades, waiting for the right moment to emerge, and Daniel understood now that he was the bridge to carry them back to where they belonged. The thought filled him with peace, though it also sharpened his sense of duty. This was not a task he could abandon midway. Just as he had finished every restoration he ever began, so too would he finish this. He owed it to Nathan, to Lydia, to Samuel and Grace, to every unseen ancestor whose lives were tangled in those satchels. He owed it to himself as well, to prove that his struggles, his persistence, his stubborn refusal to quit, had meaning beyond his own survival. As night fell and Daniel locked the garage once more, he glanced back at the Cadillac resting under the fluorescent glow. The car no longer looked broken to him, no longer seemed a ruin waiting to be mended. It looked like a vessel of hope, a monument to resilience, a mirror in which he had finally seen himself clearly. The bond between past and present was sealed, and in his heart Daniel knew the journey ahead was not simply about restoration. It was about redemption, connection, and the honoring of a legacy that deserved to be remembered. The decision Daniel had made in the quiet of his garage did not leave him with peace for long. It transformed instead into an urgency that pressed at him each day, urging him forward. Restoring the Cadillac was no longer only about bolts, chrome, and leather. It had become an act of remembrance, and remembrance demanded that the story be returned to those who had a right to it. He had accepted his role as a keeper of history, but he knew he could not keep it forever. The letters and photographs, the jewelry and medals, these were fragments of lives that belonged to someone else, and it was his duty to put them back into the hands of the family who had once lost them. He began his search in the most practical way he knew, revisiting the library where he had first unearthed records of Johnson's fine jewelry. The librarian greeted him with a knowing smile, for she had seen him return again and again, always hungry for more fragments of the past. This time, Daniel asked about genealogical records, obituaries, and city census lists. He scrolled through endless reels of microfilm, eyes burning as names and dates swam before him. Again and again he traced the name Johnson, a name common enough to be daunting. But it was Nathan he sought. Nathan and his family. The work was slow and often discouraging. There were gaps in the records, years lost to fire or neglect, articles that mentioned a Johnson but not the right one, obituaries that carried the name but not the details he recognized. Yet he persisted. Each evening, after long hours at the garage, his hands still sore from labor, he would sit at the library or at his small kitchen table with stacks of photocopies spread around him. His notes multiplied, pages filled with possible connections, crossed-out names, arrows pointing from one lead to another. After weeks of searching, he uncovered a small obituary from 1967 for a woman named Lydia Johnson, survived by her children, Samuel and Grace. The words were brief, the kind of notice placed quietly in a local paper, but to Daniel it was a beacon. He compared the dates with the photographs he had studied so many times, and it fit. Lydia, the wife whose name was written in Nathan's letters with tenderness and hope, had lived long enough to raise her children. Samuel and Grace must have grown, married, perhaps had children of their own. Somewhere in the city, or perhaps far beyond, they might still have descendants who knew nothing of what had been hidden in the Cadillac. Armed with this thread, Daniel searched further. Public records gave him hints of Samuel's marriage in the early 1970s, Grace's possible move to another county. He followed addresses that led to empty lots or new developments where old houses once stood. He drove across the city, down streets scarred by decades of decline, pausing outside buildings where, perhaps, laughter and family dinners had once filled the rooms. Each place felt like a whisper, the past brushing against him, reminding him that he was chasing shadows. There were nights when frustration threatened to overwhelm him. He would sit in the garage, staring at the Cadillac, wondering if the trail had gone cold forever. The car seemed to look back at him in silence, its hollow frame filled with patience. In those moments, he reminded himself of Nathan's perseverance, of his own father's lessons. Giving up was never an option. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, just as the satchels had waited for him. Months passed before a breakthrough came. Daniel found an old church bulletin in an archive, dated from the early 1980s, listing Samuel Johnson as a deacon. It included an address, and though decades had passed, it gave Daniel a direction. He drove to the neighborhood one Sunday afternoon, heart pounding with anticipation. The church was still there, though the paint was peeling and the sign out front leaned at an angle. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and old hymnals. He asked around, speaking quietly with members of the congregation who remembered a man named Samuel Johnson. One elderly woman, her eyes clouded with age but bright with memory, nodded slowly. Yes, she said, she remembered Samuel. A kind man, quiet, with a family he loved dearly. He had passed some years ago, but his daughter, she thought, still lived nearby. She could not recall the exact street, but she gave Daniel enough to begin searching again. Following that lead, Daniel combed through directories and public listings until he found a name that fit. Angela Johnson, granddaughter of Nathan, daughter of Samuel. The address was in the same state, only a few hours' drive from his garage. He sat in his truck outside the small house one afternoon, staring at the door, his stomach knotted. How did one approach a stranger and tell them you had found the long-buried treasures of their grandfather hidden in an old car? How did you explain the weight of history that had fallen into your hands? It took him several visits before he found the courage to knock. Each time he parked on the street, rehearsing words in his mind, only to drive away again. Finally, on a clear Saturday morning, he stood at the door with a folder of photographs and letters in his hands. When the door opened, a woman in her 40s stood before him, wary but polite. He introduced himself, stumbling slightly, then showed her the photographs. At first, she frowned, confused, but as she looked closer, her expression changed. She lifted a hand to her mouth, eyes filling with tears. She recognized them, her father as a boy, her grandparents standing proudly by the Cadillac, faces she had seen only in fading albums passed down through her family. Daniel explained haltingly about the auction, the restoration, the hidden satchels. He spoke of the jewelry, the letters, the medals that had slept untouched for nearly a century. Angela listened, tears sliding silently down her cheeks, and when he finished, she invited him inside. In her living room, surrounded by photographs of her own children, she told him of the fragments she had known. Her father had spoken of his parents, but rarely of the hardships they endured. She had never known about the jewelry store, the treasures hidden away. For her, Daniel's discovery was not just an unexpected inheritance, but a restoration of memory, a gift of roots she had not known she had lost. They spoke for hours, and Daniel left that evening with a sense of both relief and humility. He had found them. The descendants of Nathan Johnson lived on, and soon the treasures would be returned. But more than that, he had witnessed the power of history to heal, to bridge time and distance. Driving back towards his garage, the Cadillac waiting in silence, he felt lighter than he had in months. The search had tested his patience, had forced him into archives and conversations, had carried him down roads that seemed endless. Yet, it had ended in connection, in the rediscovery of a family story. The past was no longer silent. It had been handed forward, and Daniel Harper was the one who carried it. As he pulled into the driveway and looked at the darkened outline of the Cadillac in his garage, he knew the journey was nearing its final chapter. What remained now was to finish the restoration, to let the car itself speak once more as a symbol of resilience and memory, and to return the treasures to the family who had waited unknowingly for them. The weeks that followed his meeting with Angela passed in a blur of work and reflection. The connection he had longed for had been made, and now the story that had begun with rusted bolts and stubborn seats was moving toward its conclusion. Yet, for Daniel, the conclusion was not an ending but a transformation. The Cadillac still stood in his garage, stripped and waiting, and he knew that until it was restored, until it shone again, with the dignity it once held, the story would not feel complete. Returning the photographs and letters had already rekindled something powerful in Nathan's descendants, but Daniel felt that the car itself, the vessel of the memory, had to be given its voice back as well. So he worked. Day after day, often long into the night, he poured his energy into the restoration. Rusted panels were stripped down and treated, the dull body slowly transformed by sanding and coats of primer. Chrome pieces, once dulled to lifeless gray, were polished until they gleamed under the harsh lights. He tracked down parts from collectors, scoured junkyards for pieces others had discarded, and fabricated what he could not find. The garage rang with the sound of his tools, the whir of grinders, the hiss of paint sprayers, the steady rhythm of a man driven by more than mechanics. Each step was done with reverence, as though he were not only restoring steel and leather but stitching together threads of history. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to overtake him. His hands blistered, his back ached, and there were nights when he stared at the unfinished frame and wondered whether he could truly finish the task he had set for himself. But then he would think of Nathan's letters, of Lydia's quiet resilience, of Samuel and Grace standing solemnly in photographs beside their parents. He would remember the way Angela had wept when she recognized her grandparents' faces, the way she had clutched the photographs as if holding them could bring the past into the present. In those moments, the work gained new strength, and Daniel pressed on. As the restoration neared completion, the Cadillac began to change before his eyes. The lines of its body, once obscured by rust and decay, emerged sharp and proud. The engine, rebuilt piece by piece, roared back to life one late evening, its sound filling the garage like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. Daniel stood listening, his chest tight with emotion, tears threatening to rise as he thought of how long the car had waited for this moment. It was not simply a machine starting again, it was a spirit waking, a memory revived. The final touches came in the interior. The seats, once stiff with hidden burdens, were newly upholstered in supple leather, stitched carefully by hand. The steering wheel, polished smooth, felt alive in his grip. When he slid behind it, looking out through clean glass at the street beyond, he could almost see Nathan there beside him, Lydia's laughter in the air, Samuel and Grace chattering in the back. For a moment, time blurred, and Daniel felt himself not alone in his garage, but part of a continuum that stretched back nearly a century. Word spread quietly among those who knew him, and soon Angela returned, this time with her children, to see the Cadillac nearly finished. They stood in awe as Daniel pulled back the cover, the polished black paint gleaming under the lights. The car looked as if it had stepped out of a photograph, reborn. Angela touched the hood gently, her hand trembling, and whispered that her grandfather would have been proud. Daniel smiled, though his throat tightened too much for words. A week later, he organized a small gathering. It was not grand, just family, friends, a few neighbors, and members of Angela's extended family. They met at his garage, the Cadillac parked at the center, its chrome gleaming, its presence commanding attention. Daniel spoke briefly, his voice steady but filled with feeling. He told them of the auction, of the struggle to free the seat, of the satchels hidden away, of the letters and photographs that had connected him to their past. He explained how the restoration had become more than work, how it had been a mission of memory, a way to honor a man who had lived with dignity in a time of hardship. When he finished, he handed Angela a small box. Inside were the medals, the jewelry, the watches, and the letters carefully preserved. Her tears fell freely as she embraced him, whispering her thanks over and over. Around them, the family touched the items reverently, passing them from hand to hand as though cradling pieces of their own souls returned to them. Finally, Daniel gestured to the Cadillac and offered Angela the keys. She shook her head, pressing them back into his palm, saying the car belonged to him now, that he had given it life again and earned the right to keep it. Daniel hesitated, torn between pride and humility, but he accepted, knowing that his role as caretaker was not over. The Cadillac would remain in his garage, not as a possession but as a monument, a reminder of resilience and connection. As the gathering drew to a close, Daniel watched the family linger around the car, their voices soft, their faces lit by memory. He stood apart for a moment, letting the scene wash over him. The journey that had begun with curiosity and risk had led him here, to this moment of restoration not just of steel, but of heritage. He understood now that the true value of what he had uncovered was not in gold or jewels, but in the way it had reconnected a family with its past, and in the way it had given him a deeper understanding of his own place in the world. Later, when the garage was quiet again, Daniel sat in the driver's seat of the Cadillac. The air still carried the faint scent of polish and leather, the engine quiet but ready. He rested his hands on the wheel and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt not the weight of struggle, but the lightness of fulfillment. He had taken a forgotten car and breathed life into it, but more importantly, he had taken a forgotten story and ensured it would not be lost again. Outside, night had settled over the city, the street lamps casting pools of light on cracked sidewalks. Inside the garage, the Cadillac gleamed silently, a vessel of memory and endurance. Daniel knew that one day, long after he was gone, the car would still stand as a symbol, not only of craftsmanship and beauty, but of resilience, family, and the unbreakable bond between past and present. In that knowledge, he found peace. The story was whole. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Check out the videos on your screen right now for even more shocking discoveries, and share this video with your friends so they can be part of the mystery too.